Welcome to another scripture discovery session. Today we are back in 1 Peter, but we're going to take a little side trip. And if this was a movie, you would see little waves on the screen showing that we are going back into time. We have to remember that Peter is a historical figure. He's a person who was tremendously affected by his experiences, especially when it came to following Jesus. So we're going to look at one of the darkest times in his life, and that is when he rejected Jesus 3 times when he was arrested. And what we're going to do is read what takes place after that. And that's in John chapter 21, verses 1 through 19. This is where Peter encounters the resurrected Christ, and there's an interesting conversation that takes place between him and the Lord. So want to encourage you to print out this passage, to read it over multiple times, and get ready to discover with me. All right, let's do it.
John 21, verses 1 through 19. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." And they said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" They answered, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." And so they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved therefore said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place, with fish laid on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there was so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the 3rd time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you from where you do not want to go." This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, "Follow me." Well, after reading this passage multiple times, there's a few things that jump out at me. Of course, usually starts with the first word, after. And why am I marking that word? Well, it's a time reference, right? There's something that happened before this. After this, Jesus revealed himself again. So, what is it that he is referring to? Of course, what we're actually asking is what is the context of this passage? So, let me just share with you. You can read it for yourself, but I think this is kind of important to understand the full context, that he's referring to Jesus revealing himself multiple times, right? Jesus revealed himself again. So Jesus previously revealed himself to the disciples. They were in a locked room. They were in fear of the authorities, and so they locked up and they were held locked up inside this room, which kind of tells you something, doesn't it? The perspective of the disciples is still out of fear. They still didn't understand what was going on, and they were afraid of the authorities. But Jesus reveals himself to them in that room. He shows them his hands and his side to prove that he really did die and rise again. They were comforted by that, it seemed like, in the text. You can read it, like I said, for yourself. So he reveals himself to them, but there was one man that was missing, one disciple, that was Thomas. And so again, Jesus reveals himself, and this time Thomas was present, and you can recall the interaction where Jesus tells him to touch his hands, touch his side. This is proof that I'm really Jesus and that I'm alive. And of course, Thomas is convinced instantly and proclaims, "My Lord and my God." So that's the context. He's revealed himself twice. And after this, after these revelations, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. So there's a specific way that he revealed himself. It might be a little different. John actually names the disciples, which, why is he naming the disciples here? And he doesn't necessarily name all the disciples in the previous revelations. And maybe it's because all the apostles or all the disciples were there. But John is making a distinction here, that he revealed himself in this way, and he names the disciples. So this might be a smaller group, or maybe you have to ask the question, and I'm not going to write this out, but maybe you can write this out. Why does he specifically name the disciples, whereas in the previous context, he mentions them by the name disciples? Of course, he picks out Thomas, but I think it's kind of interesting that he specifically names them. So there, Simon Peter was there, and that was important. Thomas, called the twin, and I think that's interesting that he brings up Thomas again. Who was Thomas? Thomas called the twin, and why does he give that specific detail? Was there a different Thomas? So it kind of brings up the question, is this the same Thomas that John refers to in the previous context? I would assume so, but I haven't really done any deep study on it, and haven't looked at any commentaries, of course, because remember, this is an initial run-through. This is the beginning of your study. So anyways, that would be something to really look into. Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, he's really giving details of who these people are. The sons of Zebedee, I think that's kind of important. We're going to underline that, the sons of Zebedee, and hopefully you'll see why that's important that they're there. And two others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." I love that statement. You know, I try to picture that scene in my mind, and it's almost like maybe Peter's bored, that he's sitting around, he's waiting, he's trying to figure out these things. Peter's a man of action, and maybe a man that can't sit still. So he's done waiting, and so he finally decides to get up and do what he knows best, and that is to fish. So he goes fishing. They said to him, "We will go with you." And so they went out and got into the boat. But that night they caught nothing. All right. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Now I'm going to point this word out, yet. So Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. I think this is really significant. We might, I read through quite a bit without making any observations, but sometimes that happens. Maybe we'll go back, but this jumps out at me. The disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Now, the reason why I'm making this observation is as I was reading it multiple times beforehand, you'll see why this has jumped out at me. But they didn't know that it was Jesus, and Jesus said to them, children. That's kind of an interesting thing, is that he calls them children. Do you have any fish? And they answered, no. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast it. And now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of the fish. Here we go. The disciple whom Jesus loved. This is a statement we should probably be familiar with this statement. I think this is mentioned a few times in the book of John. And of course, it's referring to John. That's kind of how he titles himself. That disciple whom Jesus loved. Therefore said to Peter, it is the Lord. And I'm going to highlight that as well. And I'm going to highlight it the same color because I think there is a connection here. Because John recognizes who he is. The disciples did not know that it was Jesus. But after this statement, something pricks, I think, in John's mind, and he recognizes who it is now. It is the Lord. And then, of course, the man of action steps in. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. Now, I know this isn't the main idea of this passage. I don't think it's super important, but I do find it curious that he puts on his garment and then jumps into the sea to swim in his garment. I don't know. That's just kind of interesting to me. I don't think I would do such a thing like that. I wouldn't put on more clothing in order to swim to shore, but for some reason Peter felt like he needed to. Maybe he was scantily clad, let's just say. And since he was going to shore, he needed to make sure that he was dressed appropriately. Because it does say that he was stripped for work, which I don't I don't know what all that means, but could be a little sketchy there. I'm just messing, but that's something you can kind of think about. So I'm going to highlight this or underline it. Let's underline it. And I'm going to drop this little phrase here, cultural difference. This might be something that we just don't understand that's in that culture of the day. Of course, we can speculate what all that means, and maybe there might be some commentaries, there might be some information concerning this, but not that big of a deal. Don't want to put too much time into it. But he put on his outer garment. He was stripped for work, and so he threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but 100 yards off. Well, let me just pause right there for a minute, because as I'm reading this, there's something that comes to mind that I want to acknowledge, I want to mark in some way. I think we're going to try this. I'll start here and make my way. Pertaining to the fishing, this should sound familiar to us. So I'm going to mark that section. This sounds very familiar, and if you read this passage in your Bible with, hopefully it has some references of other passages, and then it becomes obvious that this occurrence took place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry when he is initially calling his disciples. There's an account in Luke chapter 5, and I'm running out of room. So I'm going to mark it down here. And Luke 5, 1 through 11, I'm putting it down here, and it's pointing to this phrase that Jesus uses. We're going to get to that. Kind of let the cat out of the bag in some ways by doing that, but that's okay. He put on his outer garments. He was stripped. Where are we? So the disciples continue to the shore. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. Notice that there's already fish there that's laid out, and there's bread. And then Jesus says to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So, I'm trying to picture this scene, and that's interesting that, there's already fish on the fire, but maybe there's just not enough. And Jesus doesn't feel like multiplying the fish that he already has. There's plenty that the disciples caught, and so he was having them bring it over to the fire to cook some more. I love that John gets very specific of how many fish. Sometimes numbers in the scriptures are rounded. They're a little bit more general. I'm wondering if this kind of tells us what John cares about, because he is a fisherman. So I think he's trying to point out the significance of this catch. This number may be unheard of, so he spells it out. It's 153. Kind of reminds me of fishermen who caught the big one, and every time they tell the story, it tends to get bigger and bigger, that fish. They're trying to emphasize how large that fish is. And I'm not saying that John here is exaggerating. What I'm saying is this is significant to him. So he's drawing that out. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. And just because I'm familiar with the Luke passage, this jumped out at me when I was making these connections. So I want to make sure that I do that here. The net was not torn. So take note of that. And Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. So he's eating with them. He's engaging with them in something that's very normal. Now, none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. This is a very curious sentence. We need to talk about this a little bit. Let me just point out one aspect of it, though. They knew it was the Lord. So I'm going to highlight this in blue as well because I think there's a connection. The disciples did not know that it was Jesus. All of a sudden, there was recognition. It is the Lord. And now, after all these events, they knew it was the Lord. We're going to draw some arrows to make sure we got these connections done. Okay. They knew it was the Lord. All right. So what's going on here? We'll keep it simple. None of the disciples dared ask. And we can be like, what? What is this saying here? There was something about Jesus that he was not recognizable. They couldn't recognize him. He looked different. What does this mean? We've encountered other passages where Jesus kind of hides his identity. At the end of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is walking with some of his disciples, and they didn't recognize him. And they have a conversation about the Son of Man having to die and raise again, and that this was spoken of through the book of Moses and the prophets. They did not recognize him until later on when they're sitting down for a meal with him, and he starts blessing the bread and breaking bread with them. And then all of a sudden, it was him. They see him for an instant, and then all of a sudden, he's gone. There's also a reference where Mary is talking with him, and finally, he responds back to her, Mary, because she didn't know who he was, and He just says her name, and instantly she recognizes that it's Jesus. But you can kind of look through the Gospels and find that account. But um, there's a way that Jesus hides his identity, and it looks like he's doing the same thing here. But they knew it was the Lord. Notice that this is in context of a supper or well, this is a breakfast, but it's around a meal. There's something about encountering Jesus around food that all of a sudden the lights turn on and the disciples recognize who he is. This is very similar to the encounter that the disciples that were heading to Emmaus encountered. So there's some interesting things there. And maybe the solution to this question, or the answer to this question, is that Jesus is in his glorified state. And so there is a difference in how he looks. But I don't know. I don't know exactly what's going on here. But for some reason, his identity is not obvious. This shouldn't worry us or give us any doubts, because you have to remember the other two encounters that he had with them, where it was quite obvious. He just appears to them in a locked room, and he shows them his hands and his side. Again, with Thomas, it's the exact same thing. They knew exactly who he was. Probably at those times, they were probably questioning not that if it was Jesus or not, but if he was really alive, if he was just a spirit. And I think that's why he showed his hands and his side. But this is a different situation, it looks like. Something definitely that later you would want to look into. But let's continue on. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So if everyone's counting, it's the third time. We know that from the previous context. But I want to mark this because to me it's just interesting. So the third time that he was revealed, when they finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to them, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." If you continue on, I think this is very important. We need to kind of stop right here and work through this. And I'm trying to figure out where to begin. Well, let's start out with this. Do you love me more than these? Kind of have to ask the question, what are these? And he might be referring to the other disciples. I don't know, maybe he's referring to the bread and the fish. Do you love me more than food? Okay. And then, of course, his response, "Yes, Lord, and I am going to mark this. You knew." "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Feed my lambs." And this is a very important statement, too. And I'm trying to think through how we're going to mark this because I think it's significant. And I think this is the significant word. And we'll talk about that later. But he said to him, "Feed my lambs." And then he said a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" By the way, isn't that interesting? Simon, it's not Simon Peter. It's Simon, son of John. Why is he addressing Simon Peter that way? I don't know. I think actually that's a good question to ask. Let's look at that. So why does he address Peter in this way? Now, what I suggest you do, and it's kind of hard to do this on the computer like this, but if you do have the passage printed out in front of you, to make a list of all the possible reasons why Jesus addresses Peter in this way. I have a few theories of my own. Now, it might be good for you, and it's kind of hard to do this on the computer, but if you do have the sheet in front of you, it might be good for you to list out some of the possible reasons why Jesus would address Peter in this way. That's a good practice to do, and try to think through this. I have some ideas of why, and we got to remember that we try to answer those kinds of questions within the context in which this was written. But I think there's something there that John is pointing out as he is recording this and making sure that we know that this is how Jesus addressed Peter. And I would welcome also some comments on this. So while you're watching this video or after you do your study, comment below on this video and respond back to this question. Why does Jesus address Peter in this way? Maybe we can have a little discussion afterwards about it. So I think we got to the second time. Yes, Lord, you know. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. Tend my sheep. And then he said to him a third time, the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? This time, Peter was grieved because he said it to him, what? A third time. Now, I'm just pointing these out because I just think it's interesting. This is the third time that he mentions the third time. And of course, it's for different reasons. This is the third time that he reveals himself to his disciples. But then with Peter, he asks this question 3 times. And of course, we can't help but think back to the event of Jesus' arrest and the crucifixion, and Peter denying Jesus 3 times. Of course, Jesus actually predicts this, that was going to happen. And so it's pretty clear that this is probably why Peter is grieved. Peter rejected Jesus 3 times. And now Jesus is asking 3 times, and look at Simon Peter's response. But I think Peter is understanding what's taking place here. So he's grieved. The question again, do you love me? And he said, and this is where there's a difference in the response, right? A little bit more detail in his response. But this is beautiful and touching. Lord, you what? You know everything. You know that I love you. Wow, I wonder what Peter's voice was like when he makes that statement. I wonder if it was with boldness, loud. Maybe, you think of Peter as a bit obnoxious. He's being very clear, you know everything, you know that I love you. Or if it was with trembling lips and a faltering voice. But I think that there's something significant in Jesus's question and then Peter's response and this last one that I think is powerful. You know everything. You know that I love you. So I'm going to pause here and kind of make these connections because initially when Jesus addresses them while they're still in the boat, Jesus was standing on the shore and they did not know that it was Jesus. After some interaction, and this interaction is very similar to one that takes place at the very beginning of the ministry of Jesus when he's calling his disciples. So I'll wait on bringing that up, but there's something significant there where John recognizes, wait a minute, this has happened before. It is the Lord. And Simon Peter recognizes then who he is, I think, too, and starts swimming towards him. And then after this encounter, when they get to shore, when they have breakfast with him, they're eating with him, they knew it was the Lord. So there's a progression of revelation taking place. That might be redundant to say it that way, but you see this progression of not knowing a declaration of who he is, and then they all knew it was the Lord. And on the flip side of that, we see Peter proclaiming or acknowledging that the Lord knows, right? The Lord knows that Peter loves him. And he says it 3 times, but then he makes it a little bit more emphatic the third time he answers, "You know everything. You know that I love you." So I'm just wanting to point out the theme of knowledge here, knowledge that the disciples had and how that was progressing, but then maybe you would say the omniscience of Jesus that Peter acknowledges in this. Peter knows that he loves him, and he knows, I think, now what's in his heart and that he truly loves Jesus. And because he knows it, he knows that Jesus knows as well. That's a lot of knows, I admit. All right, let's keep going, though. "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus responds back, "Feed my sheep. Feed my sheep." So let's take a look at these one by one. Starting in verse 15, he said to him, "Feed my lambs." The second time, he says, "Tend my sheep." And then the third time, "Feed my sheep." So it's lambs, sheep, and sheep. I'm just pointing out those little differences. I don't think it's very significant, but I do think it's significant that he says, "Feed my sheep," "Tend my sheep," and "Feed my sheep." So what does Jesus mean by feeding the lambs or the sheep? What does he mean by that? How is Peter hearing this? And I think that is a great question to ask. Maybe the question is how to feed the sheep and how to tend, right? So feeding and tending, what is Jesus meaning by that? Well, I think there's something here. I believe we hit on something here. Remember, we are thinking about this in light of 1 Peter. Peter writing this letter to the church. And this is very similar language that Peter uses when he's addressing the church in his letter. And I'm thinking it's in chapter 2 where he talks about Jesus being the great shepherd or overseer of our souls. And then he later goes in chapter 5 talking about the elders and the elders' role to shepherd the flock. So you have to wonder, when he's writing that to the church, if he's recalling a lot of these encounters he's had with Jesus himself, the teachings of Jesus. And now this isn't the first time Jesus brings up this metaphor of lambs and sheep, but this one's pretty significant. It's addressed specifically to Peter. And then, of course, we see later in 1 Peter that he uses the same language. I can just imagine Peter recording this and these events coming to his mind. You have to wonder, as he's writing his letter, the emotions, the heart, the thoughts that are welling up within him as he writes the letter to the church, because there is such a connection with his life, his experiences with Jesus, the teachings that he heard from the mouth of Jesus. They're so significant, and I think this really hits home when you look at this. To feed my lambs, to tend my sheep, to feed my sheep. Again, the question is, how does this look? Now, I'm not going to get into a sermon on this because I'm really tempted to. I do have some thoughts on what he means by that, how to feed the sheep, how to tend to them. And I have to because I'm a pastor, and I better know what it means to be a pastor. But that would be maybe another discussion for us to have. And like I said, we can have that discussion on commenting below in this video, or we can have a Zoom discussion too. That would be fun. In fact, we can even have maybe a live class. and talk about this. If anybody's interested, maybe we can do that, and we can specifically talk about what it means to for Peter to feed the lambs and the sheep. All right, let's continue on though. Jesus saying, "Truly, truly," which we know that he said that multiple times while he was in his 3-year ministry, proclaiming the truth, making strong propositions, assertions. He always started with "truly, truly." I guess that means we can mark it in some way. But that's a phrase that you can kind of look up and see other times that Jesus used that phrase. But he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hand, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." Now, just initially, before you continue reading, that's a bit cryptic in some ways. It's like, what is Jesus trying to say? Here's the great thing. John gives us a little commentary. The reason why I'm pointing this out is we need to make sure we identify those times when the author of whatever book we are reading in the scriptures, whether it's the Gospels, even Old Testament, but the epistles, specifically when it comes to the Gospels and even the book of Acts, so the historical narratives, there's times when the author gives greater clarity of what was either said or what was done, and that's helpful. Those are good things for us to see. All right, so basically John says it's to show what kind of death that Peter's going to have that ultimately will glorify God, because it'll be very similar to how Jesus was crucified. Now we get to the end of verse 19, and we see the word that we started with in verse 1, the word after. After saying this, he said to him, and I think this is huge, "Follow me." Now the question is what does he mean by that? It's important to read the rest of the context, and I cut it off here just because of the length. I didn't want it to be so long, but it continues on. And it appears that this conversation that Jesus is having with Peter might be one where, it's after breakfast, and they might be maybe alone, that Jesus and Peter are taking a little after breakfast walk together. So he makes this statement, "Follow me," and then we see that Peter turns around, and this is in the rest of the chapter. Peter turns around and sees John following them. So is this Jesus looking back and pointing out John and saying, "Follow me," while he's with Peter? So is this literal? Or is this John, who loves to use a play on words to say something that's a little bit deeper and referring to something else when he makes that statement, "Follow me"? So when I first read this, I forgot about the rest of the context. And so this jumped out at me because it is in Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. The whole account is very similar. So that's why I'm wondering if John is going deeper and trying to identify that there's something very significant going on with Peter's encounter with Jesus. So I want to read this passage to you. It's Luke chapter 5, 1 through 11. This is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret and saw 2 boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing." Does that sound familiar? In our passage, Simon goes out at night to catch fish, and they didn't catch anything. Here in verse 5 it says, "But at your word I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were what? Here, their nets were breaking. In our passage, what did we notice in verse 11? There were so many fish, but the net was not torn. So let me go back to Luke 5 and starting in verse 7. So the nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." So here's Peter's initial proclamation and claim of and confession to Jesus. Verse 9, "For he and all were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken." And so also were, who was there? Right? Verse 10, "And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee." That should sound familiar to us as well. Who was there? Yes, Thomas was there, Nathanael was there, but also the sons of Zebedee. They were there, and they were partners with Simon, it says in verse 10. "And Jesus said to Simon, 'Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be" what? "Catching men." And I didn't notice this before, but is there any similarities there to Jesus calling Peter to feed his sheep and to tend his sheep? In this one, Jesus is saying that he's going to be catching men. All right. Verse 11, "And when they had brought their boats to the land, they left everything and" what? "Followed him." Which brings us to the end of this passage. Jesus' last statement after this encounter, at the end, he makes, "Follow me." So yes, in the context, this could be quite literal, Jesus turning around, looking at John and saying, "Follow," or maybe to Peter, "Follow me," and they're having this discussion on the lakeside. Or John it can actually in some ways be both, because I think John does this consistently in his gospel, where he is giving details and he's giving them for a deeper purpose, a deeper meaning. So here, what is that? Why does this passage sound so similar to Luke's account when Jesus first calls his disciples? I don't know. I think John's doing something. And it comes down to this, a question that I have in my mind, and that is the point of this section, John 21, 1 through 19, and even beyond, I think through 25, is this about Peter's restoration? Meaning, Jesus is bringing him back to Peter being his disciple again, reestablishing his relationship as disciple. Remember, we already mentioned this, Peter betraying Jesus, right? Denying him 3 times at one of the most critical times in the life of Jesus, his arrest, when Jesus probably needed him the most. Peter rejected him. Remember, in that event, Peter walks away and cries bitterly. He knows what took place. There was deep sorrow and conviction, and I think this is an encounter where Jesus is reestablishing Peter, restoring him. Now, I don't want to get preachy on us right now, but I think it is appropriate to maybe pause and reflect on how this speaks to us in this encounter that Jesus has with Peter. The importance of restoration for us as rebels of God, sinners, missing the mark, and needing to be restored. For those of us who deny Christ and do not have faith in him, there's that call of becoming a disciple of Jesus Christ. But also, as we are disciples, there are times when we fall short, we trip up, we meander off the path that Christ has called us to. Our faith falters, and there's a need for us to be restored. And it's a beautiful thing. Think about this for a moment. Jesus is addressing one of Peter's darkest moments in his life. His master, his Lord, has just been arrested. And Peter, the one who comes off as brave and determined and confident, runs away. He denies Christ to a girl. I mean, it's a very dark moment for Peter. And yet Jesus comes to him with grace and mercy and brings restoration. And after Peter is restored, the call, follow me. Now, like I said, I might be rooting into that phrase, follow me, that command, follow me, maybe a little too much. But like I said, if you read the book of John, he uses words that have some deeper meaning. I can give you maybe some examples of that later on in other conversations, but I think we've done enough assessment of this passage. I think it's about time for us to finish up. Thank you for participating. Remember, this is just an initial investigation, an initial study of the passage. I want to encourage you to continue on studying this passage, to engage with it. Feel free to read commentaries on it, have other discussions with fellow believers. You can engage me with it. But remember, the whole point of all this is to prepare our hearts for the Sunday sermon. Jeff will be preaching this Sunday, 10 a.m. If you go to Converge Community Church, Google that, or Sawyer Highlands Church, our website should come up, and from our website you should be able to get to the live stream. Jeff will be preaching this passage. He has spent many hours engaged with it, studying it, the Holy Spirit ministering to him through this passage. And so what we want to do is prepare our hearts to hear from the Word of God, that the Spirit may move in us, to form us, to shape us, that we may encounter Christ. And so this is kind of the pre-work, to do some groundwork before we get fed. And maybe I'm kind of telling you the answer of what I think is taking place here when when Jesus is calling Peter to feed his sheep. I think that's what Jeff will be doing on Sunday morning. He is preparing a feast for us right now. When we sit down and hear the preached word, we are being fed. And so let's prepare for that now. Okay? Again, love some interaction, so make sure you comment below, ask some questions, or make some observations of your own. It would be great to engage with you in that way. All right, until next time.